So I am basically global black belt for security in Microsoft. So as a global black belt team, I work very closely with our strategic customers with some of their very key projects. Right now, I am driving incubation of a solution called as Entra Permissions Management. We are going to have a discussion on Entra Permissions Management and also on generally multi-cloud related permissions management. What are the different challenges that organizations are facing today, in which direction they are supposed to go to reduce their attack surface and the risk related to these permissions across Azure, AWS, and GCP. And then once I walk you through the challenges, the best practices, as well as I'll give you a demo of the Entra Permissions Management tool, which is a CIEM solution from Microsoft. At the end of the session, we will have a Q&A, and then you can ask me any questions that you have on this tool, as well as the best practice that you can adopt for multi-cloud permissions management. Now, one thing before I start, I just want to ensure is can you all confirm that you are able to hear me clearly?
Yeah, we can hear Shahla very clear.
Perfect. So first of all, I think most of us who are working in IT know that since last few years, the trend is to go towards cloud. And when we talk about going towards cloud, it's not just restricted to one cloud. Most organizations are adopting multi-cloud now. So they would have Azure, they would have GCP, they would also have AWS, or probably at least two of these clouds. How the workload is between the cloud, it may differ from organization to organization. Some could be Azure heavy, some could be AWS heavy, some could be GCP heavy. But the challenge is that the more you move towards cloud, new permissions related challenges come into picture. One of them is we see that there are across these three major public cloud providers, and it's not only these three, there are other clouds also which are available where there is OCI, there is VMware, where you might have your workloads. Now the problem is, at least in these three clouds, there are total 40,000 different unique permissions that can be granted to any identity. And when I talk about identity, again, the identity is not limited to just a user identity. So my identity can also be something which we in Microsoft called as workload identity, which is basically any identity which could be related to an application, the identity which could be a managed identity, service principals, any permissions which are also given to functions or script or any resources, that also becomes part of this entire identity management infrastructure. But because this is growing, as I said, there are 40,000 different permissions that can be assigned across the three clouds. And the type of identities are also increasing. The type of permissions that you can give is increasing. We have seen that many times the kind of permissions that are given to these identity far exceeds the kind of permissions that they really are using, which is against the principle of least privilege. So once I walk, I'll also give you a demo where we will see that what are our findings, where we see how that permission gaps come into picture. Another important aspect is, out of those 40,000 permissions that I just spoke about, we have analyzed that around 50% permissions are basically high-risk permissions. So high-risk permission can be any kind of permissions which can cause a disruption in your infrastructure. So by disruption, I mean they could have a certain permissions to delete your resources. Those permissions could be related to reading sensitive data. So these high-risk permissions, if you keep on granting to resources or identities and they are not well managed, it is obviously going to cause a lot of risk for your organization. Now, so when I talk about this difference in the gap, we called it. So there is this permissions gap which we called as permission creep index within Microsoft. So over time, what I have seen, for example, some companies, they start with a role called as DevOps role nowadays. so that their developers can also do certain activities in cloud on their own. And this is just one example. Now, in their DevOps role, they will start with some kind of permissions that, okay, my developers may need this set of permissions to be able to do their job, and we can also move towards a DevOps or DevSecOps journey using giving these kind of permissions to our developers. Now, over time, different set of developers would come in and say that, maybe we are not able to do certain tasks and we need additional permission. And then the administrator, the team would either keep on adding permissions to the role which was created, custom role that was created for the developers, or they might, just give them some inbuilt role which may have a tiny percentage of the permissions that they really wanted, but then it may also have some additional permissions which they may not require, but then they end up granting those permissions to the developers because they have no idea how to manage it. The reason they may not have an idea how to manage is because it's we all know that cloud still there is a lot of gap when it comes to learning cloud as well as learning multi-cloud. So you might have a team which may be Azure heavy and they understand Azure, they understand identities in Azure, or they understand identities in AWS, but they don't understand identities in the other cloud, which may not be their primary competency. And then those identities or those permissions, they just remain out of the, no one even knows the risk, because no one even understands the risk which are posed by the permissions given to these kind of identities in your cloud. So, and it's becoming very complex for even IAM team to manage, the on-prem identities, multi-cloud identities, different type of identities. And if that visibility and that control is not there on these identities, obviously it could lead to a risk of a breach, because someone or somewhere, that permissions, the over privileges which were granted to any identity. Again, for example, if you end up granting some excessive permission to your blob storage or your S3 buckets, obviously that is going to have some impact if those kind of resources are misused for performing certain actions in your infrastructure. So to solve this issue, Gartner came up with a new way of managing these kind of identities in cloud. They came up with a term called as Cloud Infrastructure Entitlement Management. So Gartner calls it Cloud Infrastructure Entitlement Management. There are other analysts which also call it as Cloud Permissions Management. So there are different terms which are currently going on in the market. So it could be either Cloud Infrastructure Entitlement Management, which is pronounced as CIEM, or CPM, which is Cloud Permissions Management. So these kind of solutions can actually give you a complete visibility and control on your permissions, and that could be across different clouds, not just probably Azure. So Microsoft also has one solution for this called as Microsoft Entra Permissions Management, which is basically a CIEM solution which can give this visibility and control over these cloud. Now, before I go into Entra Permissions Management, I would also want to share with you that what are the things that you can do with the CIEM solution. So what are the top risks that we see in multi-cloud, and then what are the best practices that you can adopt when you are deploying any CIEM solution in your environment. So the top finding, as I had mentioned even before, is that permissions gap. So we see that least privilege principle, which would also, for organizations who are already on their zero trust journey, would know that one of the very important component there is implement least privilege. So if your cloud identities are overprivileged, obviously the least privilege principle doesn't, you're not adhering to the least privilege principle, because there is a gap in the kind of privileges which have been granted to identity. So the best practice would be to right size these permissions. So if Shahla has been granted probably owner access on a Azure resource, or has been granted a DevSecOps access, and she has 10,000 permissions attached to it, but in last 90 days, Shahla was only using say 500 permission, you have to right size. You have to first get the visibility on this kind of permissions and then say that, okay, now remove all the other permissions, only give 500 permissions to Shahla, because she would still be able to do her job because she has been only using these 500 permissions in last 90 days, right? Not the 10,000 permissions that I may have granted her. Another thing that we generally see is this cross account. So for example, in AWS, there is this cross account access which can be provided to identities where probably an access was provided to an identity on another account, but through the first account, that identity has some overprivileges which he or she can misuse in the other account. So that also has to be checked and right size. Lack of separation of duties. A lot of users are having, excessive roles and policies, and I think SODs, most of you would know what they are. So even that should be right size. And very important thing is, one thing that my observation is in discussions with customer and those customers who are already trying this particular solution is that many times they miss the point that there is something called as workload identity. So as I mentioned, that user identity, we all know how to focus on them, but we forget that the workload identities also can be a risk to your infrastructure. So that could be any application identity. So you can directly grant in cloud, you can directly grant certain permissions to your SaaS applications, for example, or any APIs, for example, or your functions, your resources. So, and by resources, I mean things like, S3 bucket, or in AWS, or blob storage, or virtual machines in Azure, or EC2 instances in AWS. So these resources could also be granted certain permissions, and then we are not reviewing that what kind of permissions were granted to them. So it's very important to also review those permissions and then right size them. Another thing which I have not mentioned on this slide is that, and we would see it when I show a demo, is it's very important that you are also as much as possible, the idea should be, if you are going in, for example, I just mentioned 𝗬𝗂𝗵𝗀 journey, because the idea is in the cloud, you should be able to do things faster and, implement more automation. And for that, certain permissions would have to be given to the different users, and probably also different workload identities. In those cases, it's very important that the right sizing also happens in such a way that you don't give delete permissions as a permanent access, or you don't give other high risk permissions as a permanent access. So you could have a workflow saying that I would give Shahla all the access that she requires to read, do XYZ activities, probably very few delete or other high risk permissions if that's really justified for her role. But at the same time, I would also enable a privilege on demand workflow where whenever she wants any high risk or any delete permissions to doing something, she would have to raise a request, which could be auto approved also. So there's no need of someone to be there, but I could only enable it for say 4 hours, and I could perform my task, and then once my task is done, then that permission is removed. So in that way, I am always in a state of least privilege. I'm not in a state of permanently high privilege access. So with that, I would now go to the demo of what this Entra Permissions Management solution can do. There are basically 3 components that we will see now. One is discovery, second is remediation, and third is monitoring. So first, it helps you to discover those excessive permissions or discover those granular information about any identity within your multi-cloud infrastructure, basically within Azure, AWS, and GCP. It can help to, once that visibility is there, it can also help to remediate those permissions. So it can help you to right size those permissions, probably check that what Shahla was doing with her permissions in last 90 days, and decide based on that whether she should continue, or her team as a whole, maybe not as an individual, but her team as a whole, what they were doing in last 90 days. And for her group, probably you would right size, create a new role, give that role to them, and also allow Shahla to probably request for a permissions on demand workflow where she could request for additional permissions if that is required for her activities, to enable her to ensure that the user experience is also there and the security is also maintained. And then very important thing, especially for security teams, is the monitoring of the permissions. So we already have a very good discovery capability, but then you should also monitor that what is being done by by each and every identity, and these monitoring capabilities till some extent are natively available in the current cloud. But then, as I said, it's very difficult right now because of skills gap and because of other reasons. Very difficult if there is an incident, if the team is not, maybe they know Azure but they don't know AWS or GCP. They may not understand that where and how do I fetch those correct activity log for my incidents and for things like that. At the same time, how do you create alerts? So there are alerting mechanisms present, but then we know, I mean, those of you who would have worked with AWS know that CloudWatch also costs money, right? So there are other things which are involved there. So certain kind of alerts can also be created using this tool. So let me jump to the demo. And then once I'm done, maybe at the end, I'll take all the questions. So I hope everyone is able to see my screen. So let me. So this is basically the tool, the CIEM tool for called as Entra Permissions Management. It's used for helping you to do those three activities that I just mentioned. One is discover, second is remediate, and third is monitor. So what I am able to see now in my dashboard is basically something called as PCI score for AWS, Azure, and GCP. Right now I've selected Azure. So what I see is what are the number of identities and what is the permission creep index. So permission creep index is basically that gap that we discussed, permission granted versus permission used. This permission creep index is a risk score which is calculated between 0 to 100. So 0 to 23 basically gives you low risk, 33 to 66 is medium, 66 to 100 is high risk. Now what I see is that I have 46 identities, because of which my PCI score in Azure is quite high. It is 83, out of which there are 40 total users, 4 are applications, and 2 are managed identities. So as I mentioned, identities are not only users. What I'm also seeing is the trend over time with respect to my risk scoring, and I'm also seeing some findings. I'll also quickly show the same thing for AWS. So I can see how many, so I can see the same thing for AWS users and roles. I can also see something called as findings. So basically identity related findings and resource related findings. So here I'm able to see that how many of my users are over provisioned, have over provisioned active roles, or how many inactive roles are there. How many users which can do privilege escalation in my environment, or how many users can actually administrate a security tool in my environment. Similarly, resource level finding like S3 bucket accessible externally, and most of us in security know that why this is a big issue. Then open security groups. Till some extent, it also has, this also has some overlap with CSPM. For those who are already using a CSPM, and you know that this information is already available there, but this also gives you a comprehensive view, and it also can integrate with CSPM. So I would go there later. So let me show one example of what kind of reporting is available. So what you saw there was just for that particular environment, but the kind of findings that we see is much more than that. So you can see this particular role has been granted around 10,783 permissions. But that particular role has only used 29 permissions. And this is based on the data collected in last 90 days. So in last 90 days, out of the 10,000 permissions that was granted to this role, only 29 was used. And this is what I was talking about, that permission creep index. So here there is no least privilege which is implemented. Similarly, not only for roles, I can find the same information for my resources, for my serverless functions. I can find the same information for my user, for all AWS, Azure, and GCP. And this is just one of the findings related to over provisioned users. I can have other, I can dig into report of inactive identities, the S3 bucket encryption related incidents, open security groups, etc. So I can go and check each and every account here. I can also send this report at a particular schedule to my different teams who might be managing different AWS accounts or different Azure subscription. Now, the reports are also not limited to just this. So I was just showing one report, but there are multiple other reports which are available to give very granular level information about the identity related findings or identity related information. And this report says just one thing. When I talk about discovery, I can do a more deeper level deep dive into each and every identity. So for example, as I mentioned, when it comes to identity, again, not users, but also groups, active resources, task, keys, and functions are covered. So for example, if I just select a user, in case of this particular user, Maya, what I'm able to see is there are 10,783 permissions that are granted, but only 40 permissions were used. And this user has access on 1,978 resources. So I can also check at a very granular level that what exactly were the permissions that were unused, that were granted to her but were not used by her, and which were the permissions which were used by her. So these are the 40 permissions that were used. I can also do a deep dive into what kind of roles were assigned to her because of which she ended up getting these permissions, or what kind of policies were assigned to her because of which she ended up getting this permission. I can probably, if I want, I can do a more deep investigation on this particular identity. And I'm just showing it for user, but the same thing can also be done for other types of identity. I can see the access keys. I can see the access information. I can see the activity log of this user, that what this particular user did with the access at what time, from which IP address, and which was the resource that she accessed, or probably, for example, in this case, I can see that she used her delete permissions. So I can basically go in detail of each and every identity. Now, as I mentioned, that this analytics is just one part of the entire the benefit that this kind of CIEM solutions can give. Another important thing is, once you know details about your identities, once you know that there are overprivileged identities, as I mentioned, that there are some best practices that has to be adopted, you may want to do some kind of remediation. So remediation itself can be different types of remediation. So one way of remediation would be, probably I know a group of, I know a team which I want to check whether a particular team or particular, so suppose if I have a group for DevOps users, right? I may just want to find out that I want to right size the current role that was given to them. I would create a policy, and I would create a new policy for my developers based on the activity they have been doing in last 90 days. So I can actually select probably based on activity of user, or based on if they are part of a group based on activity of group, or even if I was creating a resource based policy, I could have selected activity of resource or activity of role, or I could have just said that many of the organizations use tagging, right? So for all your EC2 instances, or all EC2 instances belonging to one department might have certain tags attached to it, and I want to see that those resources, what activities they were doing. So I can create a role. I'll just give you an example how this works. So let me select some groups here. So basically what I'll do is I'll select few groups, and I'll see that the groups that I selected, out of the total tasks which are out of the total permissions that they currently have, they have been using only 24 permissions. So now what I'll do is I'll only assign these, I'll create a new role for with only these 24 permissions for that particular group. The role creation is quite simple. It can be done from within the tool and it will still go to AWS or Azure or GCP. You don't have to go to that console. You can either submit it directly from here if there is something called as controller. If it was enabled, if I could have submitted it. I won't go into detail of it right now. But I can also, if controller is disabled, basically that means my admin doesn't have access to do changes in that environment. What I can also do is I can just use the JSON file and then go and manually create the that particular role. Once I have created this new policy, now what I can do is I can also assign that particular the new role that I was using. Probably I'll select, you know, the set of users. I'll say attach policies. I'll attach the new role to that user. I'll use detach policy to detach all the existing older roles from that particular user or user group or resource group. In that way, using this one single console, I'm able to right size the permissions now. And this is just one way of right sizing. I'll also show you other ways. Another example could be in case of, in AWS, you can only do attach and detach. But in case of Azure, there are more capabilities which are available. For example, you can add role. So just to give an example, I can, for example, remove this security admin role from this user from this console. At the same time, I can do some other quick actions. So those quick actions could be just revoke some unused task. So basically, any unused task that particular identity was not using, just revoke it and probably assign a new policy with new permissions. I can also revoke high risk tasks, which I discussed as one of the best practices. I will revoke any delete related tasks. So my users or my identities, my resources cannot do any delete action on my cloud environment. Probably for delete action, they might have to make a request. I'll go to that as well. Or assign read-only status, which could be similar to your delete task. So, and this can, it's not only users, this same thing can also be applied, because we know that many times those permissions are granted through groups. So the same actions could also be taken on a group, or the same action could also be taken on an app. So, so for example, the CIEM app that we have, I can add and remove roles, and I can add and remove permissions to this application as well. Now, once I'm done with this part, okay, so probably I have now right-sized the permissions, either using the earlier role template or probably using quick action. Next step would be that my users may, or my identities may sometimes want certain permissions, which they would require to be able to do their job often. So then I can give them a permissions on demand workflow, saying that whenever you need any permissions, so it need not be based only on it need not be based only on a role, but it can also be based on a task level. So for example, sometimes a managed identity may want to do something called dynatrace observability. That particular managed identity, and again, I'm mentioning managed identity because when we think about even the privileged on demand or just-in-time access, we only think about users. But again, I will repeat that identities should no longer be considered as only users. Identity can also be my managed identity. Identity can also be my application. Now, obviously, there has to be some owner of these application who can be assigned an owner or on behalf permission to request access on behalf of these other type of non-human identities. But requesting for permission for those kind of identities is also possible. So then I can go ahead and request certain permissions. I can select at what schedule those permissions I need, whether I need it as a one-time permission or I need it weekly, daily, at a particular time, probably, you know, for 4 hours or 5 hours or whatever time I want to give. Once that is done, it will go to an approver who can approve the request. Another thing is now, which I think we all know that how the approve and things would work. So if it's approved, I would be able to see whether, those permissions are approved. If it is process means that it was approved and it went through its life cycle for whatever time it was, that permissions was granted to me. Once that permission, the time is over, those permissions would be automatically removed and I can see those processed ones in my process tab. If those permissions are still assigned to me, I would see it in my approved tab. Another thing that I had mentioned earlier was that it's also important to reduce um, the kind of approval requests that might come to your teams, right? So certain permissions you may, instead of granting it as a permanent permission, you may decide to auto approve. So you can say that if users are requesting for this set of permissions, it would go through an auto approve workflow where they will be automatically assigned that permission for whatever duration they need it. So it need not go to an administrator for approval. The benefit of this would be you would reduce certain time of your teams to go approve so many requests. At the same time, you are ensuring that the users don't have permissions at all time. You are still putting them in that least privileged bucket and only granting them permissions when they request for it. Another important feature, and we will just finish this in 10 minutes and then we will go to question. Another important feature when things mature, so once those initial step of discovery, remediation, permissions on demand is done, at some point you may also want to keep on cleaning your cloud infrastructure automatically with any unused roles. Once that understanding develops that, okay, which are those unused roles, whether there would be any impact or not, there won't be any impact. So any unused roles or whether any permissions that have been removed. So there can be a schedule which can be created saying that probably every month or every quarter or for certain type of environments. For example, you can just start with your test environment and say that anything in my test environment, let me run this automated way of cleaning up the permissions, and then I can also expand it to other environments. So there is an option to do this autopilot. Now, the last thing that I had also mentioned was something called as monitoring, which is very important when you are doing your security investigation. So I can basically, for all my different cloud environments, using one single console, I can basically get all the audit related information. So I can basically see that what my different users were doing in the environment, what actions they were taking on which resource, what task did they perform, and if it was being performed from a public IP, what was the IP address that were used. This would help you in your investigation of your incidents as well. You can also create some queries and save it. You can also export it, this data, and give to your teams or give it to auditors if that's also one of the requirements for you. Another important part is the anomalous activity detection. So basically certain activity triggers can be created to automatically create alert of certain kind of actions. So there can be multiple use cases based on the kind of industry you are in. So it can be based on resource tag, it can be based on identity. So if anything happens with this resource or identity, create an alert. Then there can be also rule-based anomaly alerts. So basically, if any resource is accessed for the first time, so there are some inbuilt alerts also which are available, which you can just configure. There are statistical anomaly. For example, if a lot of tasks were performed by one identity, so those kind of anomaly triggers can also be created. And then permissions analytics. So the same thing that we saw in the permissions analytic report in the beginning of this demo. So basically, I can say that any inactive group or any inactive role, I would create a new alert for them as well. Now the entire management of this particular dashboard can also be done. There is a user management information, user management available for this particular tool as well, where different kind of permissions can be assigned for different set of user. For example, if you have one group of team managing one subscription, they can be assigned viewer permission, or probably controller will mean that that remediation option would be there, and approver or requester. The onboarding of all the solution within this tool, it's a very simple, let's say API-based configuration. So it takes less than 1 hour to onboard Azure, AWS, and GCP within the platform. So it's not a very difficult thing. In fact, what we do now is we are currently providing a 90-day trial of this particular solution, where you could try the solution. The deployment takes only 1 hour, and then the entire data collection finishes within 24 hours. So if you want to try and actually see all the permission related gaps that we just discussed, and the best practices that we discussed, if you want to see that where you are in your environment, you could obviously try this tool. You can always connect with me if you need more information. With that, I will leave you with some resources as well, which would help you to learn more about what permission risk is, and what are cloud infrastructure entitlement management solution, what are the best practices which can be adopted when you go into this journey in your cloud infrastructure, when you go in this journey of permissions management within your multi-cloud environment. With that, any questions? I think if you have any questions, we can now discuss that.
Great session, Shahla. So what we'll do, guys, is I'll keep my video off. I'm not sure if my audio is clear or not, because we were having issues initially. So if you want to ask a question, please raise your hand. I will unmute you, and then you can go ahead and ask your question. Is my audio okay, Shahla?
Yes, your audio is completely fine.
Cool.
I'm seeing someone ask me. I'll share all the resource links. Someone asked me the resource link. I'm just sharing the screenshot for the time being, but I'll share the actual links also with you.
Great. So meanwhile, 2 people have raised hands. So Dr. Rajan, please go ahead, ask your question now.
Very happy morning, Shahla and Bikash.
Morning to you as well.
Thank you so much. I think it was a great session. The best thing that I liked is the quantification of the risk in terms of PCI, because that's a management index that is required today, because there are more and more cloud components that are coming in. But when we're talking to CISO, I think that's a very important component that is pretty well addressed. I'm very happy about the whole thing. But I see there are 2 different kind of challenges that I foresee based on my architectural experiences. One is, see, now there are multiple applications. There are very critical applications that have been built quite long time back with the monolithic architecture. Okay, and those applications also do not have the aspect-oriented design. I presume that this CIEM's tool is supposed to work on those activities that are generated by virtue of the aspect-oriented design, because you start going to read that, and from that it is going to pull out the objects or the persons and the resources who are all seeking the permission for those access. So one that I'm seeing, this is a big challenge for those kind of applications, because the CIEM solution may not be able to read and find things. Second is, now let us look at an environment which is pretty matured enough, where we got a SOAR, or we got a CIEM as well. But now there has got to be a seamless integration between these kind of tools that keep coming in, because then it becomes very, very difficult for managing the whole thing. I think these 2 are the one that I wanted to flag it. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks. That's a very good point. So I'll in fact, answer both of them. The first related to monolithic application. See, if that's the application, and I know monolithic application is always a challenge, right? Because they only work within that. Now, if it's moved to cloud, so another thing I would again want to point that this is, cloud infrastructure entitlement management solution. So this can only look at resources within the cloud environment. So if such an application is moved as is, because most of the cloud migration journeys that I have seen, many times you don't do those changes and you don't do much changes in the application. Probably whatever basic is required to just move your application as is right now from your on-prem to cloud. So if that application is moved to cloud, and after moving it to the cloud, if there are certain resources which are attached to that application. So for example, if the virtual machine which is being used, or if there are functions which are being used, those could come as part of those small changes which are done in that movement, then those kind of resources can be read by the CIEM solution, and those can be managed, but the access to that application itself, or directly to the application itself, that's not something that this solution can manage. So I think you got it very correctly. But that's not the space where this is going, and I understand at some point of time that also has to come into picture, and I think we are going in the right direction with things like cloud permissions management, where once resources are addressed, even those other layers would also be addressed, and there would be at some point of time some integration or consolidation of various different permissions management, because right now you have a lot of solutions, right? PIM, PAM, IGA, so all those have to be merged, and with cloud it would be easier to merge them at some point of time. Even the CSPM thing which I said, right, certain things that this solution shows, even CSPMs might have some overlap. So right now there is overlap between CIEM and some other things, and still there are some missing pieces as well, which would slowly get addressed as these kind of solutions mature and more cloud based solutions come into picture. Second part that you mentioned about CIEM, and it's a very important point, and I knew someone would ask me this question. See, the activity information that I was mentioning and the triggers that I was mentioning, at the end of the day, this should flow into your CIEM or source solution, because right now either most organizations are using any CIEM or source solution which probably is not helping them with their cloud-based visibility, or correctly giving them data on the cloud, because there is always some integration challenge that, okay, what do you have to, for example, there are questions which come, what kind of logs do you have to read in AWS? Probably CloudTrail, but within CloudTrail, what do you have to read? Will your security hub information will flow from AWS? What kind of from Azure? I think if people who are using Sentinel, and I would be a little biased because I'm part of Microsoft, things are still easier because a lot of Azure related let's say patterns or logs, those can be easily collected because Microsoft has already created it. But when it comes to other clouds, it's very difficult for people, even if the solution is implemented. Sometimes I see that there is a lack of proper use case creation or integration with all the cloud environment, because there is a lack of understanding of what to collect, right? So solutions like this, which can actually create those activity triggers, can integrate with your CIEM solution to actually help to provide this input from collecting. After collecting this input from cloud, it would help to push this to CIEM. Right now, I would be very clear that we don't have that CIEM integration. We had, so this solution was actually acquired by Microsoft 1 year back, and it was already having a CIEM integration. But because we are changing, we made certain changes, and we are still making some changes. So soon, I won't want to comment on when, but soon we are also again going to provide the CIEM integration, and that should be the idea, that this information should flow to your CIEM and source so that you can take some automated action, and there would be integration with other tools also.
Okay, that's thank you so much. I think that's a good explanation that you've given. So now I understand that the permissions which are granted, within the application, right, and the activities which are supposed to be managed by the application through the aspect-oriented design is not currently the scope of the solution. That's the right way of doing it.
Correct.
The right way of doing it, because the cloud is just picking up. Now, over a period of time, you would actually keep looking at that way, but now the application must have the capability. So I don't have a capability in the application, this tool is not going to do it. I think that's an understanding I wanted to make it very clear. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Thanks. Thank you.
Great
and thanks
question.
for asking that question, because I'm sure others would have the same question. So it helped them to get the right answer.
Thank you.
Dr.
Thank you.
Dr. Rajan always asks great questions. So thank you, Chief, for that, and great explanation.
Thank you, Vikas. Nice catching up after a long time. Thank you.
Likewise, Chief. 15 days sounds very long now. I know. Okay, let's go to the next question. Mr. Manicam, go ahead, unmute yourself, ask your question now.
Hey, am I audible?
Yep.
Yes, you are audible.
Okay, thank you. I think, Shahla, this is definitely a great session and a great solution. Definitely access management combination of this privilege is an ongoing challenge, and everybody have to really address with. I'm glad Microsoft is coming out with a solution with. My question is, more towards on the remediation piece of it. Once you have identified and analyzed, so the remediation piece, you propose that the permission can be revoked, and then it can be re-approved on demand. Those permissions by the respective application owner or a custodian, and that can also be automated with an auto approve model. So how are we really differentiating the bad actor and the legitimate identity for the auto approval? That's a part one. And then number two, are there any plans of linking into a continuous authentication and zero trust principles? Because this is also going to be one of the fundamental block for that.
Yeah, I couldn't. So I heard your first question. I couldn't hear the second question because I think there was some issue at my end. So the second question was.
Yeah, the second question was that are there any roadmap to align to the zero trust principle? Okay. So that is where the continuous authentication and on-demand permissions are all key, right? Depends on various attributes based authorization. So just wanted to understand any roadmap there.
So again, very great questions there. So first, related to your answer on how do you stop any bad actor from actually requesting for that permissions on demand that we spoke of, right? Because at the end of the day, that would also give them permission. See, now again, the idea is at the end of the day, when we talk about security, and I'm someone who always proposes risk-based approach, right? So if I think from a risk perspective, if Shahla, considering that giving Shahla all the permissions permanently versus giving Shahla some permissions permanently and then enabling privilege or demand, I'm reducing my risk till some extent. Now, to your point that even there we do have risk, right? And I completely agree with you that we have a risk that even a bad actor can exploit that functionality and request for permission on behalf of Shahla. So now it depends on what kind of risk appetite my organization has. Okay. Now, if my organization has a higher risk appetite, I may enable auto approval kind of a workflow and say that, okay, this risk is till some extent accepted because we have other controls also in place because of which this cannot be exploited. So no one would be able to request access, or probably this portal is only accessible from certain places. So I have those other controls in place because of which it's fine. I can do auto approval. But suppose if the organization is more sensitive about these kind of risks, I would say that I'm not going to auto approve for those kind of high privilege access, and approval would be needed. And even for that approval, we have, I did not show that in the demo, but that functionality is there. If Shahla has requested a permission and if you have to approve it, we can also enable an OTP based approval mechanism. So you can only approve the request for certain high risk permission once you get the OTP, and if you are able to approve that OTP. So again, my risk is reduced, right? So the idea is to keep on reducing the risk. Now, I would say that after doing that also, there is no risk. I mean, risk is always there, right? But then there are other controls also which can be put into place to reduce that risk. So that's your first answer. So for the second answer,
yeah. So sorry, on the first question itself, that so we need to really strike the balance of the end user experience with risk, right? So
and even there, there can be multiple levels. So for example, if I have a non-production environment, probably I can have an auto approval there, it's fine. If I have a production environment, I can still segregate it into sensitive or critical and things like that, and then decide where. So it's not that entire approval workflow has to be so that user management thing that I was showing. We can even go to a granular level and then decide that which kind of subscription, which kind of cloud environment we can, because at the end of the day, this is a permissions management tool, right? So it needs to have that kind of granular level of options to give organization that ability to decide that what's best for them. So that is already there. Second thing is on your zero trust. So this aligns very well with zero trust, because I'm not sure if all of you have, how many of you have actually seen or gone through Microsoft Zero Trust Framework. So it's available at, I will just ping the link, aka.ms/zero trust. So this is the link where we have all our zero trust related resources. So Microsoft has basically 3 principles for zero trust. One is assume breach, second is verify explicitly, and third is least privilege. So least privilege is where this solution aligns, because first it right sizes the permissions, so you are not granting over privileges to your identities. Second thing is when it comes to that automation part that you talked about within zero trust. Okay, so I would talk only about our solution. I can't talk about other non-Microsoft solutions. So within our solution to help organization implement zero trust, we have something called as conditional access. We also have something called as identity protection. So basically, you can put conditions that what kind of activity can be performed from where, and based on multiple signals which comes from identities or devices or infrastructure, certain risk factors can be defined. So one of the things which, so just to give one example, suppose Shahla Shahla just logged into her machine from India, and within 5 minutes she logged in from maybe some other country. Obviously, I can't do that travel within 5 minutes, right? So we call it as atypical travel, and that would be flagged as risk in our identity protection. And then I would be either asked to change my password, or I would be asked to basically an MFA prompt to access certain resources. So while this information is
geotagging.
Yeah. Geotagging can there are multiple others. So I just gave one use cases. They can password spray or other kind of attacks as well, and that kind of automation can happen there. Now, while that happens, at the same time, my permissions management, so my so that information would also go to my SIM. And while that investigation is happening, why this happened, so it again is based on risk, right? If I'm able to do the MFA challenge properly, if I'm able to do password reset, that means it was genuinely Shahla. If I'm not, then obviously there is something wrong. And then that investigation would also require that what Shahla's identity was doing. And this tool would help with those kind of investigation, and what would also help to determine what kind of risk Shahla possesses. So if her PCI score is low, and if the kind of permissions that Shahla has is low, obviously I don't have to bother much. But if she is one of the users with high risk permissions, then obviously I might have to take that incident more sensitive there. As we move towards, our perimeter is no longer within network, right? Identity is the new perimeter. So as we move more towards identity-based security, all these solutions would be needed to give that comprehensive view of your environment and help you decide where to focus your energy. Because even security teams would get overwhelmed, right? So again, the risk-based approach. If Shahla is not a priority user, even if something happens, it's fine, right? So that risk-based approach can only be taken if you have complete visibility on your identities.
Got it. Appreciate it, Shahla. Thank you.
Great question and amazing response, Shahla. But we are running out of time, so we cannot have very long answers and very long questions. So
sorry.
No, that's fine. I know you're very passionate about it, but we're kind of running out of time. So maybe we can have 2 more questions, very short question and short answers, please. So Somesh, before you, Sudhir had raised hand. So let me ask Sudhir first, and then you can ask your question. Okay. So Sudhirji, go ahead, ask your question now.
Thank you, Vikas. A very great session. So whatever the solutions that you have explained here, so I think you have considered major cloud providers such as AWS, then Azure, then other cloud vendor. So how is the integration takes place? So this might be very like long answer. So you can share the link to it.
And no, it's a very simple answer. Integration takes less than 1 hour because it's an API-based integration. I'll share the link with you how to enable it. And you can always connect with me. I have shared my Microsoft email ID. So any of you who wants to know about this solution can anytime write to me and I can provide more resources.
Awesome. So that's how the answer should be, right? The short one. so that we can take more questions. Okay, Somesh, go ahead, ask your question, please, and a short one if possible.
Yeah, sure. I'll try to short. So thank you very much again. I'll not waste my time in formalities. It was indeed a great session. My first question is this particular integration where we have agent or agentless or whatever, like that doesn't matter. But we have the permission management for non-human as well, like
Yes.
API, service accounts, and lot of other accounts. So those are also considered. Number two,
Yes.
do we have any dashboard kind of things where I can see the license consumers? Let's say I have an application where I have 1,000 license. Out of that, 750 are being used. Out of that, 500 are inactive. So only 250 active users are there, so that I can do my license management out of the dashboard itself.
Yes, so that's available within the dashboard. And since this has to be quick answer, I'll just show the dashboard. So within the dashboard, when you onboard the solution, you would be able to see what is the licensing and what resources are being used for doing the license count. So that information is present within the solution.
If I want to do POC in my environment, how can should I reach out to you or someone else?
You should reach out to me, because then I'll be able to guide you and help you. But then at the same time, there is a link which I will share in the chat for trying it out. But I would suggest that you reach out to someone from Microsoft so that you can get the needed help for the POC as well. If you reach out to me, I will guide you what are the next steps. I've just shared the link. So this is a 90 days trial, which can be enabled within 5 minutes. If you want, and the onboarding of the different cloud environments would take less than 1 hour, actually, using the documentation which I shared earlier.
Guys, 12 o'clock. We are kind of, top of the hour, but I cannot say no to Sarvana Kumar. So Sarvana, go ahead, ask your last question, and then I will rush my closing note. Okay, I have not enabled mic for you, so allow mic. Yeah, Sarvana, go ahead now.
Yeah, thank you, Vikas. Thank you, Shantana, for the brief session. So I have a very quick question since we are running out of time. So how you rate your CIEM solution is going to differ from the others in the market? And if I have only a CIEM solution which is good enough to address my complete cloud security posture with a multi-cloud strategy, because I know the CIEM is most focusedly on the privilege mechanisms. But at the same time, how I want to use my CSPM and CWPP, because if I have the both, what is the key aspect which I'm going to cover in a CIEM kind of a tool?
So this integrates with CSPM also. So we already have an integration with our Defender for Microsoft's Defender for Cloud. And these solutions will together at some point of time, after a year or so, you would hear more about CNAPP. So Cloud Native Application Management. So CSPM plus CWPP and SCIM would be part of that entire solution. So you are right. It would not be one single solution, but a combination of all. Second thing is, in 2016, CloudNox, which Microsoft acquired last year, was the first company which actually came up with this concept of cloud infrastructure entitlement management. So it was the pioneer in this area. And there are very few other solution providers who have this capability, and they are limited. So maybe for AWS, maybe till some extent, 1 or 2, 3 discovery, but not the remediation part. There is a report on the Microsoft website, the last website link that I had shared. I didn't share, I'll share it. So there is analysis, an analyst called Omdia has done a comparison between all the current CIEM solutions, and Microsoft is, let's say, the leader in that. So you could always, we are transparent in also sharing that information. So you could just read that report by Omdia, and it will give you that entire information about CIEM solutions.
So in your same solution final, so will you be able to have the remediation process also? That is, if anywhere you found a privilege has been misused, whether your tool is able to force the changes with your tool itself, rather than we go for a process and go for an incident and identify the alerts and taking the ticket, rather than an instant change push can be able to made it through your tool itself?
So I would say no, but there are other solutions. So as I mentioned, there is conditional access and identity protection, which can do that part. But the entire concept of CIEM solution is permissions right sizing. So this, when you talk about NIST, NIST-CSF, this basically mostly comes in the prevent section. So you're preventing things from preventing your risks or your breach to be bigger. But the detection part, till some extent, it would be able to integrate with your SIM, but then the signal should come from other places also to take that automated remediation. So the only thing that it can do is it can integrate with your SIM and source solution, where you can have playbooks to automate that part where you want to actually take action. So that SOAR capability is not where the direction where this tool would go into.
Awesome. That's where we stop. We cannot take any more questions, guys. So let me rush my closer. Great question, Sarvana. So guys, if you want to download your participation certificate that looks like this on the screen, what you can do is go to EliteCISOs website, which is elitecisos.com. Click on events, click on upcoming events, click on CP certificate. This will take you to a different Google form. Put your email address over here, put your full name, and the password or secret to download the certificate is Jai Hind, because we are still in a Independence Day week. So Jai Hind without spaces, small case, you will get your certificate over email. Once you are here to download your certificate, you might want to register for next week event as well. That's our last webinar for August. As I said, we only do 2 webinars now because a lot of physical events are happening. And by the way, we had our very first event in Black Hat, Las Vegas last week. So that was the first international event that we did. So great, you can go ahead and register for Netscope session, which is next week on Thursday. And last but not the least that everybody's kind of waiting for is Wheel of Fortune. So everybody who registered, their name have been put over here in this Wheel of Fortune. I will spin it 3 times. If your name comes, go to the chat and say yes. We will not spin it till we find the winner because we are already late. So we will spin it 3 times. If your name comes, if you're lucky, if you're in the session, go to the chat and say yes, you are in the session. Here goes the first one. So for the first one, the lucky winner is Mr. Anil Rao from Capgemini. Mr. Anil, if you are there in the session, go to the chat and say yes. Let me remove this. Now I'm spinning for the second one. And the second one goes to Mr. Gajapati. Mr. Gajapati, if you are there, go to the chat and say yes. Let me remove this one. And the last one and the last spin has picked Mr. Devakar from Bangalore chapter. My very good friend Devakar from Bangalore chapter. So Devakar, if you are there, go to the chat and say yes. With this, thank you very much, Shahla. It has been a great session. Thank you everyone for joining in. See you guys next week on Thursday, 11 o'clock India time. Bye for now.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.